Welcome everyone to Ainslie Hall. Ainslie Hall, the building behind me, is a very important building in the history both of Victoria College and U of T and indeed the whole country, because it's the first purpose-built all-female residence in Canada. In 1911, it opened its doors to all women, and this was a revolutionary concept across the country. Never before had a building been built specifically to advance the cause of female education in Canada. So the Vic community understandably celebrated a lot when Ainslie opened its doors to a full complement of young women coming to Toronto to Victoria College for their education. Now, a few years later, in 1914, tragedy struck at Ainslie Hall. It was only a few years into existence, and a fire hit Ainslie. And it was a devastating fire. Unfortunately, the entirety of the inside of Ainslie was burned to the ground. It was all wooden timber, beautiful ornate wooden carvings, none of which survived the fire. The only things that survived the fire are the beautiful facade, the exterior of the building, which is all brick and stone and mortar all over the top to bottom, including the attic. So the outside is as it was when it opened, but the inside of Ainslie Hall is completely different because of this fire in 1914. And the story of the fire in 1914 is important to our history because of the tragic loss of 3 young women during that fire. So the way it happened on that day, in October of 1914, it was the middle of the school day. Everybody was enjoying their studies. It's fall, lovely day I hear, and the fire bell started to ring. Now back then, the fire suppression systems and fire bells were very different than we have today. It was literally a bell at the top of Ainslie that rung when somebody spotted a fire. So the bell rang, and the matron, which was the adult lady in charge of the building at the time, she called everybody out to join in the front lawn of Ainslie, facing the Royal Ontario Museum, which had only opened a few years before. So the ladies of Ainslie congregated in front of the hall as they were counted by the matron to make sure that everybody was there. The matron with her clipboard ticked off one by one to make sure everybody was outside, but before long, she realized that there were 3 young women missing from her roll call of the building. This is not unusual because it was the middle of the day. Maybe these young women were at class, or they were at the library, or they were hanging out with some friends elsewhere. It was not uncommon for not everybody to be at Ainslie all at the same time in the middle of the day, even back then. So at first, nobody thought anything of it. The fire department arrived, they put out the fire. Unfortunately, it took a long time to put out the fire, and that's why the inside was completely gutted. But once the fire settled, it was a few hours later, nighttime had fallen, the matron realized that the 3 women who were missing hadn't turned up yet, and she started to get nervous. And then the fire marshal showed up to begin an investigation to determine the source and the cause of the fire. Now the fire marshal walked in the main door, again facing the ROM over there, and found complete devastation. But somehow, the marshal and his staff were able to go from the very top, from the attic of Ainslie, all the way to the basement in search of the cause of the fire. Eventually, they got to the basement, actually very close to where I'm standing right now, just down those stairs. And in the basement of Ainslie Hall at the time was a series of tea rooms and practice rooms for music. Now it's mostly storage and other things in the basement and laundry, but at the time it was places where the women of Ainslie could congregate, have tea, have a party, read, do some homework, that kind of thing. And the fire marshal worked his way through the various rooms of the basement to see if he could find anything to show the cause of the fire. Still nothing. But he discovered something very strange. The fire marshal discovered that one of the doors to one of the tea rooms was locked. All the other doors were open except for this one. So he tried to open it. Couldn't. He got the matron's key, the skeleton key for the building. Still wasn't able to open it because the lock was fused shut due to the fire. Eventually, a couple of the fire marshals got their axes and broke down the door. And they were confronted with a very horrific sight, because on the other side of the door were the charred remains of 3 young women. And it was clear from the evidence on the inside of the door that somehow they'd been locked in and that they had tried to escape. This was an immense tragedy for the community, The loss of 3 students is unthinkable today, and back then even more so, probably. And immediately the community went into mourning, flags were lowered half-mast, memorial services were held, and eventually the life of Vic moved on after this horrific incident. Over time, the fire marshal discovered that the source of the fire was a kitchen on the 3rd floor. Somebody had left a gas burner on too long, and eventually culminated in burning down the entire inside of the building. And as I say, the community started to move on, and eventually Ainslie reopened its doors. It was rebuilt. The entirety was rebuilt, and it's been renovated a number of times since. But one thing that hasn't changed since Ainslie was rebuilt and people came back to the hall was the stories that you hear about the presence of the 3 young women who died in that fire. So I'll share with you some examples. Behind me, right behind me, this room right there, that is the Ainslie Music Room. What you need to know is that 2 of the 3 ladies who perished in that fire were musicians, quite accomplished musicians. One was a violin player and the other was a piano player. And people who live in Ainslie will tell you that periodically they hear music coming from the piano in the music room right behind me. I know this sounds crazy, but when I was here, I was a Don for 3 years. I never lived at Ainslie, but good friends of mine were Dons here and lived here, and they often told that story of coming out of their rooms late at night, hearing strange music coming from the music room, coming to investigate and to find the room completely empty. A couple more. In the main hall of Ainslie, so if you go through that door and walk down the hall, you'll see a beautiful entranceway with a grand staircase leading up to the 2nd and 3rd floor. The portraits on the wall are largely of the original matrons of Ainslie Hall, the older women who look after the young ladies who lived at Ainslie. And people who live at Ainslie will swear to you that some of those paintings, their eyes follow you as you walk by. In particular, the eyes of the matron who was in charge and on duty that day of the horrific fire in October 1914. Lastly, there's a painting of 3 young women down by the staircase going down to the laundry facilities at Ainslie Hall. And people will tell you that if you're not careful, as you walk by that painting, you will feel a presence pushing you down the stairs, as if to say, get out of my way, there's a fire and I need to get out. These may sound like ridiculous stories, but if you talk to people who have lived at Ainslie for 2 or 3 years, they will tell you that strange things happen in this building. Welcome to Old Vic, specifically the Old Vic Chapel. To the people outside the Vic community, so this building is called the Victoria College Building, but to those of us in the know, we all know it as Old Vic. And it's called Old Vic for a very specific reason, because it's the oldest part of Vic. When Vic moved here from Cobourg, Ontario, to federate with U of T in the late 1800s, this building was it. This was the first building built for Victoria College, and all of the land around it at the time was empty. And over the years, Burwash was built, and Margad, and Pratt, and many other buildings were built over time. But at the very beginning, this Old Vic was it. So this building, from the very beginning, has played a very important role in the life of the college. Over the years, it's changed and adapted and been renovated many times, but parts of it have remained the same from the very beginning. For example, the beautiful lobby downstairs hasn't changed that much from the day it opened in 1889. And this room, the chapel, has been the chapel from the very beginning. Every other part of the building has at some point been something else, but this room and the lobby downstairs have been continuously used for that purpose from the very beginning. And this room, the chapel, on the 2nd floor of Old Vic, has a very different role in today's Victoria College community than it did at the very beginning. At the very beginning, the religious roots of Vic and the religious connection of Vic to what would become the United Church of Canada were very important. And this room was used for regular services all the time. Up until the 1970s, all Victoria College students had to come to chapel once a week for about an hour on Wednesday mornings, and they would enjoy endure at least a religious service in this room of at least 100 people, with the organ up there against the wall being a key part of the services. These days, religious services in this room are less common. You're more likely to see choir rehearsals or choir concerts or other kinds of concerts, or lectures or art series, or even some dramatic performances happening here rather than religious services. But this room remains very important both to the modern life of Vic and also to the history of Victoria College. To my left here, you'll see, in daylight, you'll see these beautiful windows announcing some of the primary values, the founding values of Victoria College. Intellectual pursuit, tolerance, thought, science. Immortalized in these beautiful windows, which on a beautiful sunny day are breathtaking to see. And right in the middle, you see the older version of the Victoria College crest, illuminated by the sun, right in the middle there in the middle window. But this room has also seen its fair share of strange things. And what's one of those strange things that I want to tell you about tonight. So in 1946, the principal of Victoria College died. And our principal had been a very prominent member of the community. He had led the community through the Second World War, and he was a prominent scholar, very well respected by everyone in the Vic family and the academy all over U of T and all over the country. And it was a tragic day when he died. He was an older man, he had a storied career, but he died quite suddenly of a heart attack in 1946. And at the time, the luminaries, the most important people in the Vic community, were afforded the option of using this room for important life moments, things like marriages or baptisms, or in his case, funerals. Now, our principal was a very well-respected and also very popular man, and his family decided that it would be appropriate to have two separate funerals. One funeral for the Victoria College academic community on the first day, and then a private family affair on the second day, after which he would be interred in Mount Pleasant Cemetery, not that far from here. So when this decision was brought down and the community had to prepare for it, they rolled out the carpet. They wanted to make his first funeral in particular a grand academic affair to send off their beloved principal with the pomp and circumstance and respect that they felt he deserved. So it was a beautiful day in December 1946, nice and crisp, but warm enough that people were able to gather outside in the quad before the service started. And before the service started, everyone gathered outside in full academic regalia were preparing for a pretty sad and emotional day. Suddenly, a bagpiper struck up and escorted the platform party and the rest of the congregants from the quad downstairs, up the grand staircase, through the lobby, up the grand staircase, and through those doors. There's two sets of doors over there to my right. And to the thunderous sound of the organ, the platform party walked down the aisle and took their place here on the dais. And in front of them, right where I'm standing, was the casket of the fallen principal. Now everybody in full academic regalia, lots of songs, lots of speeches. It was a very moving affair. And at the end of it, the bagpiper struck up again, as well as the organ, and the bagpiper escorted the platform party out through the doors again, and everybody else joined, leaving the room, and then they regrouped out in the quad, again, where it was warm enough to actually congregate and spend some time. Now, in the planning for this particularly strange arrangement of funeral, because of the two services, the family was faced with a logistical challenge. There was a full evening, a full night, between the two funerals, and they didn't know what to do with the casket containing the principal. So they decided, in consultation with Vic, that the most efficient thing to do was just to leave it here overnight. And that's exactly what happened. At the end of the service, when everybody was downstairs in the quad, the caretaker of the building came up here, locked the doors, turned off the lights, and they thought that was it, until the next morning when the second funeral would happen. Now back then, as today, Vic was patrolled by security guards throughout the night to make sure that everything was above board, to make sure that everybody was safe and all the doors were locked and nothing was being vandalized or stolen. And the security guards at the time paid particular attention to this building because back then, as today, there's some very important documents and historical artifacts that are stored in this building. So that night, around 1 o'clock in the morning, a security guard walks in the main door of Old Vic downstairs to do his rounds of the building. All the lights were off. He walked all the way to the top floor and he worked his way down, checking all the doors, checking all the windows and the lights. And then he got to the hallway outside the chapel. And he walked by, didn't notice anything different. But as he got to the staircase, he heard a strange sound. He was convinced that he heard the door rattling in its frame, very, very slowly, very gently. So he got closer and he investigated the door, and there was nothing going on. The door was locked, the lights were off. He even opened the door, and he found the casket here. There was nothing going on. But it must be my imagination, or the breeze, or the wind, or something. So he turned around and he locked the door, finished his rounds, and he left. A couple of hours later, he repeated the same process all over again. He walked in the building, he went to the top, and he worked his way down. But this time, when he got outside those doors, he heard very, very loud clattering of the double door, both sets of double doors in their frames. And he heard the doorknob jiggling violently. This time he was convinced something was going on. So he opened the door, threw it open, walked in. What did he see? But the casket, right here, shaking violently. And a thunderous, otherworldly moan emanating from somewhere in the room. Where else but the casket? Apparently, it was vibrating and then shaking so violently that it almost fell off the table on which it was resting. Our security guard, like I'm sure many of us, was so terrified by the situation that he bolted out of the building. He didn't even lock anything up or turn off any lights. He just bolted out of the building and he quit the next day. He refused to come back. The next morning, the second funeral happened, and it was a lovely but quieter affair just for the family. And then after that, the casket was rolled out through the doors, downstairs to the quad, into a hearse, and eventually driven to Mount Pleasant Cemetery, where our principal was buried. And you would think that's the end of the story. Except it's not. Because if you talk to the security guards who have worked at Vic over the years, they'll tell you that there is some presence in this room that occupies it when nobody else is around, particularly at night. And security guards will say that they refuse to come into this building when it's pitch black. The next time you're on the Vic campus in the middle of the night when everything's quiet and everything's dark, you will notice that the old Vic building is never completely dark because security refuses to let that happen. They still have to come and do their rounds, and they refuse to do that in the dark because of what happened to that gentleman who investigated the room and found that situation happening here with the casket in the night between the two funerals. But that's not all. So I'll remind you that our principal was a very well-respected man. His office was just on the first floor. Now it's the cafe here at Old Vic, but at the time it was his corner office. And people who have worked in that office will tell you that sometimes if you're working late and there's nobody else in the building, the door will open. And it'll feel as though somebody has just come in and sat down in front of you at your desk, but of course there's nobody there. People who have their offices on this floor will tell you that the same thing happens. Not so much with people, presences walking in, but certainly doors rattling and doors closing suddenly. The other thing is the organ. What I didn't tell you is that our principal was also a very accomplished organist. And every once in a while, when the mood is just right and the sound of the building is just right, if you're just standing here in the middle of the evening, you'll start to hear the organ playing, even though there's nobody here. Welcome to Emmanuel College. Emmanuel College is a very important building, both in the current life of Vic, but also in the history of Vic, because it was the first United Church seminary built in Canada. Now, why is this important to Vic? Because the United Church of Canada was a relatively new institution in the 1920s when the federal government passed the Act of Union. They united a few different Protestant denominations into one United Church of Canada. And when the institution was founded, they decided that they needed a place to train their religious scholars, their priests, their devotees, the people who would be part of the organization. And they decided to establish Emmanuel College, the first United Church seminary, right here at U of T, particularly on the Victoria College campus. So in the late 1920s, when this building was opened, it began the marriage between Victoria College and Emmanuel College into what today is known as Victoria University in the University of Toronto. So this building, both to the history of Vic, but also to the history of Canada, is very important because it was the first place where the scholars attached to the brand new at the time United Church of Canada could congregate and study and learn their craft in the unique style and methods of the United Church of Canada. Now, if we fast forward a couple of years to 1934, a man by the name of Adolf Hitler is running Germany, Nazi Germany. And it's unfortunately somewhat lost to history that some of the first victims of the Nazi regime in Germany were actually scholars and academics, particularly liberal scholars and academics who were seen to be against the hard right doctrine of the Nazi state, the then brand new burgeoning Nazi state. And when that happened, a number of scholars scattered from Germany all over the world to continue their studies in more tolerant parts of the planet. Canada was very blessed that a number of German scholars immigrated to Canada. They thought at the time temporarily, but many settled and made excellent, fulsome lives and lived out their days in Canada. And one particular group that left Germany were actually more progressive, liberal religious scholars, predominantly Protestant, attached to the Lutheran Church. And some left Germany, came to Canada, and helped the United Church of Canada develop their new theology with the help of their Lutheran brothers and sisters coming from oppressive Germany. One scholar in particular, Dr. Schmidt, immigrated from the southern part of Germany to Toronto to teach and to study and to publish from right here at Emmanuel College. And he was an expert in particular kinds of doxology that at the time were very important to the development of the United Church of Canada. But he himself was a brilliant but very eccentric man, in particular because he lived his life on a very strict regimen. Every day was the same, and it was a well-known fact that Dr. Schmidt lived a very regimented life where every day was exactly the same. Let me walk you through a typical day for Dr. Schmidt. He lived on Charles Street, just up the quad from here, which at the time was full of Victorian row houses that were predominantly used as housing for staff and instructors at Vic. So he lived up there around 7 o'clock in the morning. He would leave his home, and he would go to Burwash Hall for his breakfast. Then he'd come here, and his office was just down the hall. We're in the large classroom on the main floor of Emmanuel College. Just down the hall, down there, was his office at the end of the hall. And he would proceed from breakfast to his office to work for a couple of hours. And then he'd decamp upstairs to the Emmanuel College Library, which is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful libraries on the U of T campus, if not the most beautiful library on the campus. And he would work there for a couple of hours and then take his lunch. He would go back to Burwash for lunch at High Table, which still happens at Burwash Hall, which is the high table at the front of the room where luminaries of the college and scholars and academics and guests gather for lunch there. And then after lunch, he would teach. Typically, he taught for a couple of hours in the afternoon to doctoral and master's students. And then after that, he would go back to his office, do some more work, over to Burwash after that for his dinner, and then back to his home by about 8 o'clock at night. And every day was the same for Dr. Schmidt. Which is why it was very strange when one morning he just didn't turn up. He didn't show up at Burwash, he didn't turn up at his office. As the day rolled on, he didn't show up for his students. His students thought maybe he's disappeared for a couple of days, he's gone on a vacation, he's gone out of town, so they didn't think much of it. But 2 or 3 days later, they started to get worried. Nobody at the college community had seen him for days. So the principal then of Emmanuel College walked up to his office and knocked on the door, and nobody was there. The door was locked. But he decided to respect Dr. Schmidt's privacy and leave it for a couple more days. Now, about a week after his initial not showing up, people started to get very worried. So again, they checked his office, knocked on the door, no answer. A squad of police went up to his house on Charles Street, knocked on the door, no answer. They broke down the door. There was nobody there. They searched the whole house, couldn't find anybody. There was a pile of mail as high as my waist here, probably, for after that long. But there was nobody there. So they put out an APB for him, which is to say that the cops all over Toronto started to search the hospitals, the prisons, ditches even, parks, cemeteries, anywhere, to see if he had turned up. Even the morgues. They checked to see if he had died and gone unidentified and being laying there in a city morgue. But he was nowhere to be found. So the cops, now very concerned, decided that the one place they hadn't checked yet was his office. People had knocked on his office door 3, 4, 5 times, but nobody had actually gone into the office. So the principal turned up at the door with the skeleton key for the building and opened the door. And he was shocked and horrified to find the lifeless and at this point decomposing corpse of Dr. Schmidt hunched over his desk just at the end of the hallway here. And the interesting thing is that there was no evidence of a struggle in any way. The only thing that looked out of place was there was what would have been a pile of books on his desk was knocked over on the floor. But otherwise, the lock was intact, the door was intact, the window was intact, even the lamps were still on. Everything looked normal. The only other thing that was out of place, to an astute, keen eye, was that the cup of pencils that Dr. Schmidt was usually very fastidious about keeping neat and tidy on his desk was on the floor. So immediately, the cops began a murder investigation, suspected foul play. Interviewed everybody they could find all over the college. Anybody who knew him was subject to an interview from the then Toronto Police Service. And turned up nothing. There was no evidence of anything going on, nothing nefarious, nobody seemed to be out of place. But then the coroner for the city of Toronto conducted an autopsy and found very subtle traces of a drug that does not exist naturally in the human system, but when administered, makes it look as though you've had a heart attack. Because at first blush, it looked as though he had simply had a heart attack and been keeled over his desk, but in fact, there was trace amounts of this drug in his bloodstream. And the police immediately ruled that there was some sort of foul play. This drug was in his system, but there was no connection to anybody at the college or anybody around, and certainly no motive for why anybody would poison Dr. Schmidt to kill him dead and to wipe him out of the picture here at Vic. And shortly thereafter, once the investigation concluded unsuccessfully, the usual things happened. A funeral was held, memorial services, etc. And for a while, there was a Professor Schmidt a fellowship named in his name here at Emmanuel for a scholar to come from abroad to study his particular area of doxology in the Protestant tradition. And that was that. Or so we thought. The war, of course, rolled on, and over the 30s, more and more scholars turned up at Vic and at U of T, and were welcomed into the Victoria College and U of T community. And then the war ended. And once the war ended, lots of staff, professors, students came back to Vic. They'd been fighting abroad, came back to Vic, and life continued at Vic, as it does to this day, calmly and peacefully. But as with the other sites that we visited on our tour tonight, the people who spend the most time in this building will tell you that Dr. Schmidt continues to roam these halls. And there are a couple of key places that he likes to hang out. So one spot I mentioned is his office at the end of the hall here on the first floor. You can see his office from the quad, if you look past the statue of the crucified lady, just on the other side of this window here. It is very clear that you can tell, you walk by this office, and every once in a while the window will just pop open, even if there's nobody inside. This happened to me when I was here. I remember one particular night, my fourth year, walking through this part of the campus very late at night, and I was scared out of my wits because I heard a creak happening behind me. I turned around, and it was a window opening. And later, as I conducted the research for these ghost stories, I learned that that was Dr. Schmidt's office. And in further research, in talking to librarians and professors and security guards who work in this building and who are here late at night, they'll also tell you that another spot that the late Dr. Schmidt likes to frequent is the library upstairs. As I mentioned, this is a stunning library with a lot of very old texts, some dating to the late 1800s, but a lot from the 1930s. And a lot of them in German. I mentioned that a lot of German scholars came to Vic and they helped build the library. And these books are rarely used by students of Emmanuel today. So the librarian will tell you that these volumes that very few people check out anymore, every once in a while they'll turn up to work in the morning and find a stack of these German books on the table, as if somebody had been there working overnight and not put them back. The other, I mentioned that Dr. Schmidt was very fastidious about this cup of pencils that he kept on his desk. People who work on the second floor in particular around the library will tell you that if you put a pencil on your table, within 5 or 10 minutes, it will mysteriously roll off. It won't stay on the table and nobody can tell you why. And lastly, particularly late at night, which Dr. Schmidt was known to not really be here late at night very often, but particularly late at night, people will tell you that they are convinced that they hear footsteps going down the hall to what was Professor Schmidt's office.